All right, it's your resident Batman here, Nagel. Have a look at him. What a gorgeous man. Um, but uh, the last recording, part four, it might be a bit of a lengthy one once again. So we're going from page 445. Just a reminder, the last one finished with Nagel talking about when reductionist theories work, which is basically any time where our subjective nature doesn't really offer us any insights, but rather when we can objectively know things. So I used the example of geometry in the last video. Whereas with this one, whereas the problem of consciousness is not like that. It is necessarily subjective. So any attempt to illuminate consciousness without link to that subjective nature makes it wrong. It omits something that's really important. Okay, and so this is the point that Nagel is making. And what we're going to see in this next section is sort of a further critique of materialism, why he doesn't think materialism is a particularly good theory, and then we're going to get to the end point where he sort of offers a conclusion based around how things would have to exist for the materialists to be right, and then why he thinks that they are more likely wrong. Okay, so page 445, pens and highlighters at the ready, and we're going from the bottom paragraph, so starting from while we are right to leave. Okay, so here we go. But while we are right to leave this point of view aside in seeking a fuller understanding of the external world, we cannot ignore it permanently, since it is the essence of the internal world. He's talking about our subjective point of view here. When we're looking at things like, explaining the principles of a triangle, we can leave our subjective point of view behind. But when we're trying to explain our internal world, we cannot leave our subjective point of view behind. And not merely a point of view on it. Most of the neo-behaviorism of recent philosophical psychology results from the effort to substitute an objective concept of mind for the real thing in order to have nothing left over which cannot be reduced. So what Nagel's talking about with neo-behaviorism here, behaviorism is a school of psychology that argued that behaviors are really the only things that matter, the things that we can see. And at the time of writing, there was this neo-behaviorism, using the better technologies that had been developed to develop an understanding of our behavior, why our behavior occurs. And basically, the philosophers that are offering the materialist perspective, like Smart, are jumping on the back of that to say, well, our mind is actually just the behavior of our brain. But Nagel is saying that this is leaving something very important out. Okay, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue how this could be done. So what Nagel's saying here is if the materialists are right and the subjective nature of consciousness, of experience, can be explained in a purely physical way, then all of our physical theories that we've got at the moment in all of the sciences are not doing that job. Okay, so basically what we're saying is if the mind is physical, then we don't have a theory in science that actually explains it. And this is why it's so confusing. We have no explanation of the mind in any physical way at all. Okay. The problem is unique. If mental processes are indeed physical processes, then there is something it is like intrinsically to undergo certain physical processes. What it is for such a thing to be the case remains a mystery. So really, this comes back to the point that Nagel's made a few times now, that the materialists are ignoring the what it is likeness of consciousness. Now, there's quite a hefty footnote here where Nagel uses another philosopher's idea, Kripke's idea. And look, I'm not going to read through the whole thing. Right towards the end of it, you've got a little part in brackets about solipsism. Don't worry too much about that. Just above that, it appears to us that we can imagine any experience occurring without its associated brain state and vice versa. Now, this is something that Smart talks about, and I think he deals with quite effectively in his reading, this idea that, well, I can imagine that I can dream without a brain doing the physical side. Now, it's worth noting this is why it's in a footnote. Nagel doesn't necessarily adopt this into his theory, but he's saying it's that kind of idea. Okay, there seems to be a separation between the mental and the physical, because we can comprehend dreaming without the physical. Out of body experiences are a good example of this. We can comprehend an out of body experience. And really what that means is I can imagine that my mind can be active, but my body is not. Okay, or at least not in the corresponding way it usually is. Life after death is an example of this. Not that that is what Nagel is arguing for, just to be clear. But yeah, as I said, Smart sort of deals with this and basically writes it off as, well, I can imagine a whole range of things. It doesn't mean that they have to be true. Um, just because I can imagine my brain processes being turned off, but my mind processes still working, doesn't mean that that's actually possible. So have a read through the footnote, have a read through what Kripke said. But yeah, it is a footnote. So Nagel isn't really using it in the core of his argument. He's just using it as a parallel. It's sort of like this kind of idea. What moral should be drawn from these reflections, and what should be done next? It would be a mistake to conclude that physicalism must be false. Important point here. Okay. It would be a mistake to conclude that physicalism must be false. Nagel is not saying that he has proven materialism wrong or physicalism wrong. Okay. That is not what he's saying at all. As he's already said before, it's possible that the mind is physical and that our current scientific theories of the physical world are just wrong, or that there's a really important part missing. This is possible. It's happened in the past. In the last video, we talked about sound waves. Until wave theory was developed, there was a really important part of life that we had no explanation for. Now we do. So it is possible, but at the moment, it feels like we're not even taking a baby step towards it, because the materialists are just ignoring consciousness and writing it off as not existing. But back to the point that Nagel's making, really important. He's not saying that physicalism must be false. Okay? Nothing is proved by the inadequacy of physicalist hypotheses that assume a faulty objective analysis of mind. It would be truer to say that physicalism is a proposition we cannot understand because we do not at present have any conception of how it might be true. So physicalism may still be true, but currently it's hard to even imagine how it would be true. So we need a pretty fundamental, change in science. A real scientific evolution would have to occur to be able to bring consciousness in to the physical world. Okay. Now, again, Nagel's not saying that this is not he's not saying that therefore it can't happen. It could. It just seems unlikely. There's a little bit of Occam's razor about this part to Nagel's writing. Like, it could happen, but we're talking about a really big change. And this isn't a change in the way that other things are a change, like the sound waves I was talking about, because they are external to us. Explaining lightning as the release of electrical charge, that's external to us. We're talking about explaining the internal experience of those sorts of things. This is very different to the things that we've explained with new theories in the past. And so it's possible, but Nagel thinks that that's a big, big thing that would have to change. Perhaps it will be thought unreasonable to require such a conception as a condition of understanding. After all, it might be said the meaning of physicalism is clear enough. Mental states are states of the body. Mental events are physical events. We do not know which physical states and events they are, but that should not prevent us from understanding the hypothesis. What could be clearer than the words is and are? So Nagel is really clearly summarizing the physicalist theory here, and it's what Smart would agree with. You know, brain states are, or mental states are brain states. That's it. Experience is brain states. The activity of the brain. And that's what Nagel's saying here. This is what they're saying. And we can understand that. We don't need to wait until we have the development of the perfect brain scanning machine that allows for every neuron to be explained. We don't even have to wait until that's happened. We can say, yeah, yep, I agree. Okay. I can understand what you are saying. I can understand the hypothesis that my mind, the activity of my mind, my qualia, is actually just the activity of my brain. Okay. But okay, Nagel's going to be rebutting here, but I believe it is precisely this apparent clarity of the word is that is deceptive. Usually when we are told that X is Y, we know how it is supposed to be true, but that depends on a conceptual or theoretical background and is not conveyed by the is alone. We know how both X and Y refer and the kinds of things to which they refer, and we have a rough idea how the two referential paths might converge on a single thing, be it an object, a person, a process, an event, or whatever. So just to pause here, this is kind of breaking down arguments in a way that philosophy quite likes to do, really stripping away all the excess. So the materialist position is a all X's are Y's position. And what we mean by that is their position is that all perceptual experience, okay, all sensation, to use Smart's wording, are brain states. Okay, so everything that our mind is our brain. Our mind is our brain. Qualia is our brain. Consciousness is our brain, or at least the functioning of it. Okay, so all X's are Y's. It's what we call like an absolute argument. So there's no exceptions to this. There are no mental states to you that are not just the workings of your physical brain. Okay, now, if this seems a bit odd, I'll give you an example to help contextualize it a little bit. Most of you listening to this know me as your teacher, your philosophy teacher. My children know me as their father. Okay. Now, this is not to say that there are two different things. Okay. The me that is the teacher and the me that is the father actually converge into one person. There is one person that sort of embodies both of those two very separate people. And so this is quite easy for us to understand because we know this concept. We know that people play different roles in their lives. You are most likely, at least, a student, but then you're also a friend, or a son or a daughter, or someone who works on the drive-through window at McDonald's. That is who you are. And the student is who you are. And so we're very familiar with this concept that people can sort of play multiple roles. And this doesn't mean that they're different people. Like the fact that I am both a teacher and a father does not mean that I exist as two things. It just means that the me who is a teacher is the same as the me who is a father. This is one person. Okay, all X's are Y's. Me as a teacher is me as a father. These aren't separate things. So we're very, very familiar with this concept. The question that Nagel is offering is, but is the mind like that? Okay, do we have a concept to explain how the mind is the brain in the same way that it's very easy for you to understand the concept that your teacher, for most of you at least, your teacher is also your father? Okay. Quick shout out to anyone who I don't teach. Thanks for getting on board with the Handy Philosopher. Yeah, hope you're enjoying it. I never expected anyone beyond the people who have said must listen to these videos as part of their coursework to ever listen to these videos. So welcome aboard. Thanks for joining us. But continuing on. But when the two terms of the identification are very disparate, it may not be so clear how it could be true. We may not have even a rough idea of how the two referential paths could converge, or what kind of thing they might converge on, and a theoretical framework may have to be supplied to enable us to understand this. Without the framework, an air of mysticism surrounds the identification. Now, really important point here. Okay, so Nagel is saying we lack the conceptual how to explain that why the mind is the brain, because it's very separate. Okay, this isn't the same as our conceptual understanding that people can play two roles in society. Not like that at all. But so we lack this sort of theoretical framework. In other words, we lack a theory that explains how the body and the mind are actually the same thing. At the moment, materialists are just saying that they are, but they're not explaining how. Well, how does qualia exist then? How? How does this exist? Where does it exist? You know, that internal picture that I've got, or the internal monologue, where am I seeing that? How am I hearing that? That is the how that needs to be explained. So when materialists say all sensations are brain processes, well, how? How is qualia a brain process? Show me the brain process that is qualia. Okay. This is at the moment a question that Nagel believes, at least, is just being ignored by the materialists. Okay. Now, importantly, at the end here, when he says that there's a certain mysticism that surrounds this identification, what he's saying is he's basically leveling the same charge that materialists quite often level at dualists. So often you'll hear materialists talking about, I know I've mentioned this before, but like the ghost in the machine, the magic that's required to explain our existence. There's this physical thing and it's really complex and it's constructed in a certain way so as to allow for perception. And then there's this magical mind or soul or ghost or spirit, whatever you want to say, this magical thing that also embodies it and is like the driver of the body. Now, this, materialists quite often talk about this as being a laughable idea, okay, and not one that we should accept, because without any evidence, we can claim magic in anything. Those of you in my class, the Locke Theory is a good example, my go-to example of this. I understand how a key and a lock works, but I could say, like, it's conceivable that there is a fairy that exists within that lock, that when I put the key in, it's actually the Locke Theory that unlocks the lock. It's possible, but it would be silly to believe that. Okay, this is what the materialists are saying it's like to believe in dualism. But is it? Because this is not the same as the Locke Theory. Because we are the Locke Theory. We experience our consciousness and our qualia. So it's not making up something that there's no evidence for. You actually have direct evidence of your consciousness and your qualia. Okay, it's there. The materialist saying it would be silly to believe in it. What then? Like, what is my qualia then? What is my what's my perception, my sensations? They don't feel like brain activity, I'll tell you that much. Okay. So what Nagel's doing here is saying, well, at the moment, the materialists are basically just saying mental states are brain states, just cause. I don't need to explain it. Just have faith that I'm right. They just are. Okay, and this is, a pretty big problem. Why should, if the materialists are saying that the dualists rely on a certain form of magic to explain the mind, well, it seems like the materialists are doing that too. They're offering a just cause, just trust me, basically a mystic argument. Okay, how is the brain creating qualia? It just is. this seems unsatisfactory. And this is the point that Nagel's making. So it's a very interesting one because to a certain degree, it neutralizes the materialist uh, reply to dualism that it's suggesting a magic that's not really there. Uh, and what Nagel's saying is, well, the materialists and the physicalists are doing that too. Um, this explains the magical flavor of popular presentations of fundamental scientific discoveries, given out as propositions to which one must subscribe without really understanding them. For example, people are now told at an early age that all matter is really energy. But despite the fact that they know what is means, most of them never form a conception of what makes this claim true, because they lack the theoretical background. Okay, so to use an example that we're more familiar with, you can understand that lightning is an electrical discharge. Now, I would love to be good at physics. I genuinely would, but I just don't get it. Okay, I'm not good enough at maths. I never studied the actual hard science of it. I wish that I had, but as much as I wish to be a physicist, I'm not. I can understand that lightning is actually an electrical discharge, and I can be like, yeah, no, I get it. I don't get it. Okay, I understand that it is. Like, I accept that that's what lightning is. It's just an electrical discharge, but I don't really I don't understand how that works. Like, what? Ionized water particles? How did that happen? Why does it happen? Why does it create what it creates? I don't know. I don't know any of that stuff. Okay, but that doesn't stop me from understanding the concept. Okay, and not smart, what Nagel is saying here is the materialists are kind of using this attitude that society has, where they accept what science says, while still being ignorant of how it actually works, and the materialists are offering that explanation for consciousness. Okay, um, this, Nagel says, is basically a step too far. It's perfectly fine to explain lightning as an electrical discharge and for the general public to go, yeah, okay, I get it, but I don't really understand it. But, I understand the concept that you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense to me, even though I don't actually understand the physics of it. Um, but there is a something that it is to be you, to be an individual. And a scientist simply saying that that is your brain. Um, this doesn't seem like it's the type of thing where we should go, yeah, okay, I understand that. Like, I can understand that concept. Nagel thinks that what you're doing when you're doing that is actually ignoring your consciousness. Okay, I can understand my brain processes even though I don't fully understand the working of neurotransmitters and neural transmission and stuff like that. But um, that's not to say that I am understanding my consciousness when I'm doing that. Okay. So Nagel's sort of saying that the materialists are sort of piggybacking on this almost trust that the public has in what science reveals to us, and trying to get consciousness in on that, where people don't really question it. They don't worry about the how because they don't know how lightning is created. They just know that it is an electrical discharge. They don't understand the science. Okay. Um, uh, Theoretical background. At the present time, the status of physicalism is similar to that which the hypothesis that matter is energy would have had if uttered by a pre-Socratic philosopher. We do not have the beginnings of a conception of how it might be true. In order to understand the hypothesis that a mental event is a physical event, we require more than an understanding of the word is. So imagine going back in time to ancient Greece and saying to, Socrates, I come from the future, and in the future, we will have access to a device that is about the size of your hand. Within that device, we are able to access the entirety of the world's knowledge. Uh, we'll be able to access texts from around the world. We'll be able to communicate with people from all around the world. Most people will use it to take photos of themselves, though. Imagine saying that to Socrates. Like, what? This would seem absolutely inconceivable. Okay. This idea of like an interconnected world where we can access almost anything anytime we want. What? Yeah, these are people who had to travel for months on a boat just to get somewhere. And now you're telling me that I can talk to someone on the other side of the world and actually see them in real time with a device the size of my hand? It seems absurd. Okay. Um, Nagel is basically using this as an analogy for what the materialist or the physicalist position is like now. This is what their argument is like. Okay. The mind is the brain. What? But what about my consciousness? What about qualia? Where's that? How do you explain that? There's so much left unanswered that like it would take a seismic shift in science to be able to answer it in that way. Okay, and now um, this is what Nagel's saying here. It's just it's so that theory is in such an early stage of its infancy that we would be silly to accept it as a given already. Okay, this is not to say that it won't get better. Remember, Nagel himself has said that he's not disproving physicalism, but at the moment he's saying we shouldn't be accepting it in you know the same way that if you spoke to someone from the future and they talked about some sort of super weird thing that we can't even comprehend now. Um, okay, buddy. Cool. Just you know no sharp objects around that person. Um, we do not have the beginnings of a conception of how it might be true. In order to understand the hypothesis that a mental event is a physical event, we require more than an understanding of the word is. The idea of how a mental and a physical term might refer to the same thing is lacking, and the usual analogies with theoretical identification in other fields fail to supply it. They fail because he's talking about using lightning as an analogy here. So that analogy of lightning being electrical discharge, it's not cutting it. They fail because if we can construe the reference of mental terms to physical events on the usual model, we either get a reappearance of separate subjective events as the effects through which mental reference to physical events is secured, or else we get a false account of how mental terms refer. For example, a causal behaviorist one. So really, at the end here, we're, if we're explaining the mental as the physical, we're doing one of two things. We're either uh, ignoring the subjective nature of mental events, which is what he's saying the materialists are doing, or what we're doing is we're just creating, what he says is a false account. So basically, we're saying that mental events are something that they aren't. Okay, so we're either accepting that mental events exist, but categorizing them in a way that they are not, or we're just flat out ignoring that they exist. Either one of these doesn't actually explain it. Okay, it would be the equivalent of not of saying that lightning is electrical discharge, but of saying that lightning doesn't exist. Okay, that's the equivalent that we would be dealing with. Okay. Strangely enough, we may have evidence for the truth of something we cannot really understand. Suppose a caterpillar is locked in a sterile safe by someone unfamiliar with insect metamorphosis. And weeks later, the safe is reopened, revealing a butterfly. If the person knows that the safe has been shut the whole time, he has reason to believe that the butterfly is, or was once, the caterpillar, without having any idea in what sense this might be so. One possibility is that the caterpillar contained a tiny winged parasite that devoured it and grew into the butterfly. Gruesome, but uh, what Nagel's talking about here is we can we're comfortable with this idea of okay, well there can be concepts that we're not quite sure of because we don't have the perceptual capability to be sure of them. Like if I've never studied um, insect metamorphosis, then the transition of caterpillar to butterfly, that's weird. Okay, and if that happens behind closed doors, then yeah, that's super weird. So Nagel's suggesting that we might be in this exact position with trying to explain the mind and the body. Uh, we're just coming up short because much like, the caterpillar goes into the safe and then the guy opens the safe later on and there's a butterfly. Well, I could have ideas about how that happened, how that change has occurred, but if I have no understanding of the basic biology, then I'm not going to just stumble upon that idea. Okay. And so this is the sort of shift that Nagel is talking about might be necessary for the materialist or physicalist position to be um, correct. There must be some really crucial part of physical reality that we're not even comprehending yet. Um, it's worth noting that even though this, text was written a little while ago now, arguably we're no closer to that. We're no closer to explaining the phenomenon of the mind, the qualia. So for what it's worth, I think this idea is still definitely alive and kicking in the mind-body debate. We'll continue on though. It is conceivable that we are in such a position with regard to physicalism. Donald Davidson has argued that if mental events have physical causes and effects, they must have physical descriptions. He holds that we have reason to believe this even though we do not, and in fact could not, have a general psychophysical theory. His argument applies to intentional mental events, but I think we also have some reason to believe that sensations are physical processes without being in a position to understand how Davidson's position, without being in a position to understand how. Davidson's position is that certain physical events have irreducibly mental properties, and perhaps some view and perhaps some view describable in this way is correct. Um, so this is sort of the idea that all physicalist theories at the moment are lacking. Okay, that there is irreducibly mental properties to physical events. Perhaps this is the best explanation that we can get. That yes, the physical reality is the physical reality, but um, there is a mental property that's sort of linked there that is not being explained when we explain the physical. But nothing of which we can now form a conception corresponds to it, nor have we any idea what a theory would be like that enabled us to conceive of it. Okay, and then obviously there's the footnote down there, but oh, that one's just a reference. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead. So again, maybe this physical explanation is out there, but we're so far away from understanding that it's highly unlikely that we're going to get there anytime soon. And at the moment, there's not even any signs pointing towards it. Very little work has been done on the basic question from which mention of the brain can be entirely omitted, whether any sense can be made of experiences having an objective character at all. So this is a really important question that Nagel's raising, and like he's talked about it previously, but he's bringing it up again. The real question, he argues, is not whether the mind is the brain. It's whether the experience of the mind, whether we call that qualia or, consciousness, whatever, whether that can even be objective. Is it even possible to have an objective understanding? Or is this so necessarily subjective, you have to view it from your perspective, from your point of view, that any attempt to explain it in an objective way is completely wrong. For what it's worth, he's not saying that that's the case, but he's saying that this is a question that's not really being discussed about whether the mind can even be explained in an objective way. Does it make sense, in other words, to ask what my experiences are really like, as opposed to how they appear to me? We cannot genuinely understand the hypothesis that their nature is captured in a physical description unless we understand the more fundamental idea that they have an objective nature, or that objective processes can have a subjective nature. I'll just read out the footnote at the bottom for this one. This question also lies at the heart of the problem of other minds, whose close connection with the mind-body problem is often overlooked. If one understood how subjective experience could have an objective nature, one would understand the existence of subjects other than oneself. So this footnote's actually quite helpful in understanding Nagel's point here. What he's really saying is, if we could understand minds in an objective way, then surely we would be able to be certain that there are other minds. Earlier, Nagel referred to solipsism in one of his footnotes. For those of you unfamiliar with it, solipsism is the very extreme view that you are the only being in existence. In the mind-body debate, it's usually linked to the idea of, well, you are the only mind that exists. There are no other minds. Now, no, I'm not saying that this is what Nagel is saying, but if it was possible for us to know of other minds, wouldn't we know of other minds? Wouldn't we have at least some inkling, some way to determine whether another person that we're talking to has a mind, let alone, a bat or whatever? At the moment, we assume they do because they act like us, but we have no experience of it. Now, Nagel would say the reason we don't have experience of it is because the mind is necessarily subjective, and we can't have an objective view. Okay. All right, over the page, and I'll just shift here. So this is where Nagel begins to make sort of his conclusion. He sort of starts to speculate, okay, well, what would an objective explanation of experience be like? And so he'll talk about that before finishing off by basically bringing it back to that idea that the real problem with materialist theories today are that they are ignoring the most compelling part of the debate, which is experience, our sensory or internal experience, our qualia. Okay, so continuing on. I should like to close with a speculative proposal. It may be possible to approach the gap between subjective and objective from another direction. Setting aside temporarily the relation between the mind and the brain, we can pursue a more objective understanding of the mental in its own right. At present, we are completely unequipped to think about the subjective character of experience without relying on the imagination, without taking up the point of view of the experiential subject. So this is the classic, like, well, before you judge someone, walk a mile in their shoes. This is exactly what Nagel's pointing out. At the moment, there is absolutely no way that I can possibly have any understanding of your conscious experience unless I try to adopt your point of view. And even then, arguably, I don't actually get your perspective. I get sort of my perception of you, and then an idea of what your perception would be filtered through my judgment of you. But this is as close as we actually get. So even the poorest attempt at the moment is completely reliant on one person trying to adopt the point of view of another, trying to enter the subjective nature of their consciousness. And obviously, this is never going to yield objective truth. This should be regarded as a challenge to form new concepts and devise a new method. An objective phenomenology not dependent on empathy or the imagination. Though presumably it would not capture everything, its goal would be to describe, at least in part, the subjective character of experiences in a form comprehensible to beings incapable of having these experiences. So what Nagel's saying here is, to gain some sort of objective view, we need to somehow be able to adopt the perspective of someone else, but not using imagination or empathy. Okay, so empathy is, what I said before, that idea of, walk a mile in someone's shoes before you judge them. So it's that trying to see things from another person's perspective in order to understand them a little bit better. Okay, the imagination one is interesting. I mean, try and even just fiddle with the idea itself of trying to see something from someone else's point of view, but without the aid of imagination. Um, yeah, but this is what Nagel is saying. Well, this is kind of what it would take to try and get an objective view um, of consciousness. We would have to develop such a phenomenology to describe the sonar experiences of bats, but it would also be possible to begin with humans. One might try, for example, to develop concepts that could be used to explain to a person blind from birth what it was like to see. One would reach a blank wall eventually, but it should be possible to devise a method of expressing, in objective terms, much more than we can at present, and with much greater precision. The loose intermodal analogies, for example, red is like the sound of a trumpet, which crop up in discussions of this subject, are of little use. That should be clear to anyone who has both heard a trumpet and seen red. But structural features of perception might be more accessible to objective descriptions, even though something would be left out. And concepts alternative to those we learn in the first person may enable us to arrive at a kind of understanding even of our own experience, which is denied us by the very ease of description and lack of distance that subjective concepts afford. Um, so this is Nagel sort of fleshing out this idea of an objective view uh, of the mind, and he uses, we've all heard these sort of very esoteric ideas of like, oh, blue is like it's like the first winter rain, that sort of stuff. If you think I'm making this up, then go to your local Bunnings or Home Hardware or whatever, and just take a few moments to gaze at some of the color names. There's winter wisp and you know, hog's breath, midnight sun, all of these sorts of things to name colors. And the idea here is, well, we're trying to give some sort of um, we're trying to develop some sort of objective explanation of the experience of that color. But we know that these are very, very, very poor. Okay, they're not very accurate um, uh, explanations of color at all. But Nagel's saying it would have to be something sort of like that, but that actually worked. This is what it would look like to develop an objective view of experience. Okay. Um, and as you can, I mean, if you're not thinking about it already, then just try and think of how you could explain something like color to someone who's has never seen color in a way that actually made them understand what it is like to see color. Okay, I'm not talking about the wavelengths and things like that, but what it is actually like to see color. Um, I certainly can't think of a way. Um, Apart from its own interests, a phenomenology that is in this sense objective may permit questions about the physical basis of experience to assume a more intelligible form. Now, the footnote here is a good one. I might just read it out quickly. I've not defined the term physical. Obviously, it does not apply just to what can be described by the concepts of contemporary physics, since we expect further developments. Some may think there is nothing to prevent mental phenomena from eventually being recognized as physical in their own right. Now, this is basically what Smart says in his reading, that eventually we'll get there. Eventually we'll figure it out. We'll figure out the physical explanation of consciousness. Okay. He says we're not there yet, but another 100 years of development, 1,000 years of scientific development, surely we'll get there. But whatever else may be said of the physical, it has to be objective. So if our idea on the physical ever expands to include mental phenomena, it will have to align them to an objective character, whether or not this is done by analyzing them in terms of other phenomena already regarded as physical. It seems to me more likely, however, that mental physical relations will eventually be expressed in a theory whose fundamental terms cannot be placed clearly in either category. Now, the reason that I'm reading this out, the reason that it's important, is because what Nagel is projecting here is how he sees the solution to this problem coming. Is it possible that one day we'll develop a better understanding of the physical world, universe, and be able to explain consciousness as just a physical thing? Potentially, yes. This is possible. Okay. Um, but I mean, if it is, then we're a long way from it, and our understanding of consciousness as such a subjective thing would have to really fundamentally change for that to be the case. What Nagel seems to be saying instead is that he thinks the best we can probably hope for is the way that the subjective mind sort of interacts with the physical body, how one interacts with the other. Maybe we'll never be able to explain the subjective nature of the mind, but we might have a better explanation for how it interacts with the body. This is what he says, at the end, will eventually be expressed in a theory whose fundamental terms cannot be placed clearly in either category. So perhaps this will be a whole new venture of philosophy and science. Perhaps we're missing some crucial element. And that will actually reveal how things work. But at the moment, we're not there. All right, almost there. Aspects of subjective experience that admit this kind of objective description might be better candidates for objective explanations of a more familiar sort. But whether or not this guess is correct, it seems unlikely that any physical theory of mind can be contemplated until more thought has been given to the general problem of subjective and objective. Otherwise, we cannot even pose the mind-body problem without sidestepping it. So again, Nagel's coming to his overall conclusion, which is really that we need to take a step back in the mind-body debate. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can talk about whether the mind is physical or non-physical, before we can try and espouse about the nature of the mind, we really first have to try and figure out whether the mind and what we experience as the subjective mind, so our experience of qualia, whether it's even possible for that to be known objectively. Okay, we need to go back to that question. We need to take a few steps back from where we're at, because the materialists are running ahead. They're saying, yeah, it'll get solved one day, or they're denying the existence of it altogether. It just doesn't exist. Qualia isn't really there. Our experience says that it is. It's very real to us. And so this is what Nagel is really pointing out. We need to take a step back, and we need to talk about subjective versus objective. Is it even possible to objectively know what it is to be a bat? Okay. Thank you, Nagel, forever in our hearts now as the real Batman. I wonder if he had that weird Christian Bale deep voice when he was like lecturing and things like that. I shouldn't say had, he's still alive. But yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed Nagel. It's certainly an interesting read. It's rare to get such a good explanation of dualism from a modern day dualist. And so, yeah, if you've got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Have a great day.